It was another morning at Jefferson High, a prestigious school in Birmingham, Alabama. The school's brick buildings gleamed under the soft morning sun as students flooded the hallways, their laughter and chatter echoing through the air. Groups of kids gathered near their lockers, some discussing last night's football game, others whispering about prom drama. But for Malcolm Brooks, this morning wasn't like any other. Unlike most of his classmates, who came from families of doctors, lawyers, and business executives, Malcolm was a black farm boy in a school where wealth and skin color often dictated respect. His day had started hours before the other students even opened their eyes. Long before the first school bell, Malcolm had been up, milking cows, feeding chickens, and hauling heavy sacks of grain across his grandfather's farm. His hands were rough with calluses, his boots still dusted with Alabama soil. He had wiped off the sweat, changed into his best school clothes, ones that were a little too worn, a little too faded. But no matter how hard he tried, he never quite blended in. As he stepped into his history class, he felt the familiar weight of Ms. Calloway's eyes on him. She was standing at the front, her arms crossed over her chest, the same sharp, scrutinizing glare she always reserved for him and a few other students who didn't come from acceptable backgrounds. Ms. Calloway was known for her strict discipline, but it didn't take long for Malcolm to realize that her standards weren't the same for everyone. She showered praise on the well-dressed, affluent white kids, calling them promising and gifted. But Malcolm, she barely acknowledged him unless it was to call out a mistake. The lesson began, and Malcolm did his best to focus, flipping through the pages of his textbook, but the words blurred together. His body still ached from waking up at dawn, from lifting crates of feed heavier than some of his classmates. He shook off the exhaustion, trying to stay alert. But before he could catch up, Ms. Calloway's sharp voice cut through the air. "Mr. Brooks," she said, her tone dripping with impatience. The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward him. Malcolm felt his chest tighten. "Tell us," she continued, her lips curling into a smirk. "What year did the Emancipation Proclamation go into effect?" Malcolm blinked, his mind scrambling to recall the exact date. He knew this. He had read about it. But his brain wasn't moving fast enough. I think," he started, but Ms. Calloway was already shaking her head. "If you spent less time running around the fields like a farmhand and more time studying, you wouldn't embarrass yourself like this," she said. Laughter erupted across the room. Malcolm's face burned, but he kept his mouth shut, his fists clenched under the desk. But Ms. Calloway wasn't finished. She turned to the class, shaking her head dramatically. "It's always the same ones, isn't it?" she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. A few of the students laughed again, but the others shifted uncomfortably. Even those who had smirked moments ago seemed to sense that something about this wasn't just a simple joke. Malcolm gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay calm. But then she said it. "Honestly, some people just aren't built for academics," she said, her voice almost casual, as if she was just stating a fact. "Maybe you should stick to what you know best, picking cotton, working the fields, and staying out of classrooms where real students belong." A cold silence swept through the room. Even the ones who had laughed stopped. Even the ones who had smirked froze. Even those who had looked away snapped their heads back toward her in disbelief. Malcolm felt the blood drain from his face. His breath came in short, shallow bursts. He heard someone whisper, "Did she just say that?" He saw a few students glance toward him, their expressions shifting from amusement to uncertainty. But no one said anything. No one spoke up. His hands clenched into fists so tight that his nails dug into his palms. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind. Respect isn't given. It's earned. Slowly he stood up, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "Just because I work on a farm," he said, "doesn't mean I don't deserve respect." Ms. Calloway smirked. Then prove it, she said. Otherwise, leave my classroom. Her words hit him like a slap. He looked around, searching the faces of his classmates. Some of them looked down at their desks. Others avoided his gaze. No one was going to stand up for him, not a single person. Without another word, Malcolm picked up his books, slung his backpack over his shoulder, and walked out of the room. His heart pounded in his chest, not from fear, not from humiliation, but from pure, unfiltered rage. That night, as he helped his grandfather, James Brooks, repair a broken fence under the dark Alabama sky, he stayed silent. But his grandfather had lived long enough to know when a man was on the edge of something big. James watched his grandson work, noticing the tightness in his shoulders, the way he gritted his teeth, the fire in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "You want to talk about it?" James finally asked, leaning against the fence post. Malcolm didn't even look up. "Nothing to talk about." James let out a slow sigh, shaking his head. "Some people," he said, "only respect power. And sometimes, you gotta remind them where real power comes from." Malcolm paused, gripping the wrench in his hand. "What's that supposed to mean?" James smirked, reaching into his pocket and pulling out his phone. "I ever tell you about my friend Mark?" he asked, a knowing glint in his eye. Malcolm frowned. "Mark?" James tapped a few buttons on the screen, then held up the phone, showing a contact name that made Malcolm's heart skip a beat. Vin Diesel. Malcolm stared at the name, then at his grandfather. James just chuckled, slapping his grandson's shoulder. "Get some rest, son," he said, walking back toward the house. "Tomorrow's going to be interesting." Malcolm had no idea what his grandfather meant. But by the next morning, the entire school was about to learn a lesson they would never forget. The next morning, Jefferson High was just as it always was. Students spilling into the hallways, teachers preparing for the day, the smell of freshly brewed coffee wafting from the teacher's lounge. But there was something different in the air, a subtle tension, an unspoken curiosity that rippled through the students as whispers spread like wildfire. Something was happening. Something big. Malcolm walked through the halls, his head held high, though inside, he was still fuming. He had barely slept the night before. His grandfather had been cryptic about whatever he had planned, and Malcolm had almost convinced himself that nothing would actually come of it. Maybe James had just been trying to lift his spirits, to remind him that the world was bigger than Ms. Calloway's narrow-minded cruelty. But as Malcolm made his way toward his first class, he noticed the looks, the stolen glances, the way conversations hushed the moment he walked by. Something was off. Then he heard it. A low, distant thudding. Faint at first, barely noticeable beneath the usual morning bustle, but steadily growing louder, stronger, closer. A rhythm that didn't belong. A vibration that sent a ripple of unease through the campus. Students stopped walking. Teachers looked up from their lesson plans. Heads turned toward the windows as the sound became unmistakable. The deep, powerful pulse of helicopter blades cutting through the sky. And then someone shouted, "Yo, there's a helicopter landing on the football field!" The entire school seemed to shift at once. Students flooded toward the windows, pressing their faces against the glass, their mouths hanging open in disbelief. The rhythmic pounding of the rotors grew deafening as a sleek, black helicopter descended from the sky, kicking up dust and debris as it touched down right in the middle of the field. The symbol on its side was unmistakable, a logo that had been splashed across Hollywood billboards and action movie posters for decades. Someone gasped. Someone else muttered, "No way, no freaking way." The door of the helicopter swung open, and out stepped a tall, broad-shouldered man, dressed in all black, his signature bald head gleaming under the morning sun. The entire school froze. Even the teachers. Even Ms. Calloway, who had come rushing out of the building, her face twisting in confusion and disbelief. Because standing there, right in the middle of Jefferson High's football field, was Vin Diesel. The silence that followed was absolute. Then came the screaming. A wave of pure, unfiltered chaos erupted as students rushed toward the field, phones whipping out of pockets, cameras flashing as voices clashed in excitement and confusion. Is that really him? What is he doing here? I swear to God, if this is a prank, I'm dropping out. Malcolm stood frozen in place. His brain struggled to catch up with the sight in front of him. He turned, searching for some kind of explanation, but then he saw his grandfather. James Brooks was already walking toward the field, calm and collected, as if this was just another day in his long, storied life. He glanced over his shoulder at Malcolm, the faintest smirk tugging at his lips. "Told you," he muttered, motioning for him to follow. Malcolm forced his legs to move. His heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might explode. His classmates were still in a frenzy, pushing forward, trying to get closer, but security was already holding them back. The only people being allowed through were Malcolm and his grandfather. Ms. Calloway had finally found her voice. "Excuse me," she snapped, pushing through the crowd, her heels clicking against the pavement. "What is going on here? This is completely inappropriate." Vin Diesel turned to face her. He didn't say a word. He just looked at her. And for the first time since Malcolm had known her, Ms. Calloway hesitated. James Brooks chuckled under his breath. "Ms. Calloway," he said, his deep, southern drawl cutting through the noise. "I heard you had some thoughts about what my grandson is and isn't capable of. Figured I'd bring someone in to help set the record straight." Ms. Calloway's face twisted. "I don't know what you're talking about," she snapped, though her voice lacked the usual confidence it carried. "I treat all my students equally." Vin Diesel raised an eyebrow. "That's so?" he asked, his voice slow, deliberate. The entire school was watching. The students, the teachers, the principal who had just stepped out of the building, his expression somewhere between shock and fear. The cameras were still rolling, every phone in the crowd capturing this moment in crisp, high definition. Ms. Calloway was trapped. Malcolm felt a shift in the air. He had never seen her like this, cornered, unsure, exposed. And he realized then that no matter how much power she had wielded over him in that classroom, it was gone now. She had spent years looking down on students like him, thinking she was untouchable. But today, in front of Vin Diesel, his grandfather, and the entire school, she was nothing more than a woman who had finally been held accountable. James Brooks reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a check, a very large check. "See," he said, holding it up just enough for her to see the amount. "This school gets quite a bit of funding from me. Built the science lab, donated to the sports programs, even made sure this history department of yours had all the resources it needed." He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "But I don't think I'll be supporting a school where teachers are out here humiliating kids for doing honest work." Ms. Calloway's face drained of color. Vin Diesel crossed his arms. "Maybe," he said, his voice low and measured. "You should think about what kind of example you're setting." Silence. Malcolm felt the tension snap like a rubber band. And then, for the first time in his entire life, he saw fear in Ms. Calloway's eyes. She swallowed hard, looked at the cameras, looked at Malcolm, looked at the check in James Brooks's hand. Then, finally, she spoke. I apologize," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Malcolm took a slow breath. He had imagined this moment in 100 different ways. He had imagined fighting back, yelling, storming out of school, and never looking back. But now that it was here, he realized he didn't need to do any of that. He had already won. He stepped forward, looking straight at her, his voice steady. "I don't need special treatment," he said. I just want to be treated with respect." Another silence. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, someone started clapping. And then another. And then the entire school erupted into cheers. Ms. Calloway turned and walked away, her head low, her steps stiff. James Brooks tore the check in half and let the pieces drift to the ground. Vin Diesel clapped Malcolm on the back. "You're a smart kid," he said. "Smarter than most people in that room." Malcolm smiled. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he could breathe. And as he walked through the halls of Jefferson High that day, he realized something. He had never needed to prove anything to people like Ms. Calloway, because respect wasn't given. It was earned. As the cheers roared through Jefferson High, Malcolm felt something shift deep inside him. It wasn't just the thrill of watching Ms. Calloway's face fall or the sight of his classmates rallying behind him for the first time. It was something more. A kind of weight lifting off his chest, a realization that he had never needed their approval, never needed to prove himself to anyone except himself. For so long he had accepted the stares, the whispers, the casual dismissals, believing that silence was the safest option. But standing here now, with Vin Diesel shaking his hand, his grandfather standing tall beside him, and the school erupting in applause, he knew that silence had never been the answer. Principal Lawson finally pushed through the crowd, his face tight with unease. He was a man who had built his career on maintaining control, on ensuring that everything at Jefferson High ran smoothly, but there was nothing smooth about today. The cameras were still rolling, the students were buzzing with energy, and Vin Diesel was standing on his football field like it was a movie set. The principal cleared his throat, plastering on a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mr. Brooks," he said, addressing James, though his eyes kept flickering toward Vin. "Perhaps we should take this conversation to my office." James chuckled, shaking his head. "Nah, I think we're just fine right here." He turned to Malcolm, eyes twinkling with something like pride. "You got something you want to say, boy?" Malcolm looked around. This was his moment. He could feel it in his bones. He stepped forward, feeling the power in his own voice for the first time in his life. "I've spent my whole life working hard," he said, his voice clear, unwavering, "waking up before dawn, putting in the effort, taking care of my family. And I've been told that makes me less than. That because I work with my hands, because I come from a farm, because I don't have the same money or background as some of the other kids here. I don't belong." He looked right at Ms. Calloway, who was standing stiffly near the edge of the crowd, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. "But that's a lie," he continued, shaking his head. "And I know it's a lie because I'm standing here right now. I've got a grandfather who built a life out of nothing, a family that works harder than anyone, and I know that what I do, what we do, matters. So if anyone here still thinks I don't belong, that I don't deserve to be in this classroom, in this school, in this world, that's their problem, not mine." The crowd erupted again. Principal Lawson looked like he had swallowed a lemon. Ms. Calloway didn't move. Vin Diesel grinned, clapping Malcolm on the back. "That," he said, "is what I call a monologue." Laughter rippled through the crowd, the tension in the air finally breaking, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Malcolm felt light. But Jefferson High wasn't going to just move on from this moment. The video footage spread fast, faster than anyone expected. Within hours, clips were flooding Twitter, TikTok, Instagram. Vin Diesel lands at school to defend Black Farm Boy. High school teacher gets humbled in front of Hollywood icon. Jefferson High exposed for discrimination. It was everywhere. Malcolm's phone blew up with messages from people he didn't even know, people across the country cheering him on, telling him he had inspired them, that his story mattered. And just as fast as the story spread, the consequences started rolling in. By the next morning, News crews were parked outside the school. Reporters were scrambling to get statements. The school board called for an emergency meeting. Parents were furious, demanding answers, questioning whether Jefferson High had a deeper problem than just one bad teacher. Some of them were angrier about the publicity than the discrimination itself. But the damage was done. Ms. Calloway was suspended immediately. Not just for what she had said, but for a pattern of discrimination that students had finally started coming forward about. Turns out, Malcolm wasn't the only one who had suffered under her gaze, under her sharp words meant to cut kids down instead of lift them up. His classmates, who had once been too scared to speak, were finally finding their voices too. Malcolm sat in his grandfather's truck that evening, watching the sunset spill orange and pink across the Alabama sky, his mind still spinning from the past 24 hours. "You did good, kid," James said beside him, his hands resting on the wheel. "Real good." Malcolm let out a breath he hadn't even realized he had been holding. "It's just crazy, you know," he said. "One day I was just me. The next, the whole country is talking about what happened." James nodded. "That's how it works," he said. "Ain't about how loud you yell. Ain't about who's got the biggest stick. It's about what you stand for and whether you're willing to hold your ground." Malcolm thought about that for a long moment. He had never seen himself as someone who could change things, who could make people listen. But now he wasn't so sure. A buzz from his phone pulled him from his thoughts. Another text, another 100 notifications. But one stood out. An unknown number. A simple message. "You ever thought about acting? Call me." Malcolm frowned, reading it again, and then his eyes widened. The name attached to the number? Vin Diesel. His grandfather glanced over. "Something interesting?" Malcolm just laughed, shaking his head, staring out at the setting sun. "Yeah," he said. "You could say that." Malik stood up in the middle of class, his voice rising clearly and proudly. "My dad is a firefighter." But instead of focused silence or a single word of encouragement, the atmosphere shifted sharply, like an invisible chill creeping along the walls. A few giggles bubbled up from the front row. Then came Mr. Callahan's laugh, not warm, not amused, but dry, sharp, and dripping with contempt. It was a typical quiet morning in early October, Texas sunlight streaming through half-drawn blinds, casting pale gold across the classroom desks. The old air conditioner hummed in the background, still fighting off the lingering heat. Room 12B at Springfield Middle School carried the faint scent of dry erase markers. Cafeteria tater tots and that strange, indescribable smell everyone associates with being 13. At the front of the room, Mr. Callahan, neatly buttoned polo, thinning gray hair, glasses slipping down the bridge of his nose, was scrawling a large blue sentence across the whiteboard. "Who do you admire? And why?" He turned, snapped the cap back onto his marker with dramatic flair, and said, "This morning, I want each of you to tell us about someone you really admire. Someone real. Could be a leader, someone in your family, a historical figure, but let's keep it grounded. No superheroes today." A few students chuckled. One muttered something about Batman. Mr. Callahan smiled politely. "No capes, just courage," he added. In the back of the room, Malik Thompson sat up straighter. His hand rose. Not fast, not flashy, just firm. A quiet kind of certainty. Malik didn't speak often in class, but when he did, it mattered. Mr. Callahan scanned the room, then nodded. "Go ahead, Malik." Malik cleared his throat, then spoke with steady pride. "My dad is a firefighter." The room held its breath for a moment, and then it happened. The laugh. Short, dry, unmistakably adult. It came from Mr. Callahan himself. Not a loud belly laugh, but something colder, sharper, a clipped, dismissive sound, like a scoff forced through clenched teeth. He tilted his head, half grinning with disdain. "Oh, that's dramatic." He turned back to the board. "Anyone else? Maybe someone currently serving, someone verifiable, a public figure, perhaps?" Malik's hand dropped slowly. He blinked. For a moment, he wasn't even sure what had just happened. His eyes swept the room, hoping someone, anyone, might say something. But there was only silence. His classmates shifted in their seats, avoiding his gaze. A few glanced at Mr. Callahan and chuckled awkwardly. Jason, Malik's best friend, sat just 2 desks away, his head lowered, now deeply engrossed in the stitching on his sneakers. At this point, I was furious. How could a teacher behave like that? If you feel the same, drop a 1 below. Class went on. Names floated through the air. Barack Obama, Serena Williams, Coach Jenkins from the varsity team. Mr. Callahan nodded, writing words like resilience, strength, and integrity on the board. But not once did he write firefighter. Not once did he write Malik's dad. When the bell rang, Malik hadn't said another word. He packed up his binder slowly, careful not to wrinkle the handout he had worked on the night before. As he passed Mr. Callahan's desk, the teacher didn't even look up. The hallway was buzzing with its usual post-period noise, laughter, footsteps, casual chatter. But to Malik, it all sounded like distant static. He walked alone, head down, sneakers squeaking slightly on the polished floor. By the time he reached the lunch table, Jason and the others were already deep into conversations about sneakers and TikTok drama. No one mentioned what happened that morning. No one asked if he was okay. Malik barely touched his food. He just pushed the mashed potatoes around with his fork and nodded when someone cracked a joke, though he hadn't really heard it. When the final bell rang, he was one of the first out the door. Outside, the sun had warmed the sidewalks and made the white paint in the pickup lane shimmer. A familiar red Ford Explorer slowed to a stop. Dusty, slightly dented at the bumper, but its windshield clean and gleaming. Behind the wheel was Jerome Thompson, tall, broad-shouldered, in his late 40s. His uniform shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled to the elbow, and the station badge still clipped to his chest pocket. Sweat streaked his brow, but his face lit up the moment he saw his son. "Hey, champ," he said, reaching over to open the passenger door. "Good day?" Malik climbed in and shrugged. It was fine. Jerome nodded slowly, sensing his son's deflection. He didn't press, just gave Malik's shoulder a gentle pat and pulled away from the curb. They drove in silence past the elementary school, the little Mexican bakery Jerome liked, the fire station on 3rd and Cypress. Jerome raised a hand to greet the crew outside polishing the fire engine. Malik didn't look. At home, a modest but warm 1-story house. The air felt cooler inside, thanks to the ceiling fans spinning above and the faint scent of lemon floor polish that still lingered in the air. Malik dropped his backpack in the hallway and slipped quietly into his room. Jerome stood there for a moment, keys still in hand, watching his son's back disappear behind the door. That evening, over dinner, Jerome asked softly, "Something on your mind?" Malik shrugged again. "Nah, just tired." The same answer he'd given too many times. Jerome looked at him carefully. "You sure? You've been quiet lately." "I'm fine," Malik said, eyes fixed on his plate. He barely touched the pasta. Later, lying in bed with the ceiling fan spinning slow above him, Malik stared at the glow-in-the-dark stars stuck to his ceiling. The silence pressed down like a weighted blanket. He replayed the moment in class. The laugh. The way Mr. Callahan had said, verifiably. Like Malik had claimed something ridiculous, like saving people from burning buildings wasn't real enough. He turned to his side and pulled open the drawer beside his bed. Inside were old photos. One of his dad in full turnout gear carrying a kid down a ladder, another from last year's Father Sunday at the station, where Jerome had let Malik try on a helmet so heavy he could barely hold his head up. There was even a picture of the entire Station 17 team from last month's recognition ceremony at City Hall. Malik stared at the photo, jaw tight. He didn't make anything up. His dad was a firefighter. But in that classroom, in that moment, his truth had been laughed off like it didn't count. And maybe that's what hurt most. The following week moved slowly, like a record playing a few RPMs too slow. Malik returned to class each day, sat in the same seat near the back, and said little. Mr. Callahan resumed his usual rhythm, lectures delivered with dry certainty, open-ended questions that were never truly open, and the occasional good job tossed across the room like a bone. He never mentioned that Monday morning again. Never addressed the laugh. Never gave Malik a second glance. But it was the absence that screamed the loudest. The space where acknowledgement should have lived was now filled with something colder, indifference. And that, somehow, stung even more. At lunch, Jason started sitting with another group. Not maliciously, just slowly, like a ship drifting away from its dock. The space beside Malik stayed empty more often than not. He didn't protest, didn't ask questions, didn't force conversations. He just watched the days pass like a parade that no longer marched for him. Jerome, for his part, began to notice changes too. Malik's appetite waned. He stopped bringing his sketchbook to the fire station on weekends. On Sunday mornings, when they used to go for pancakes and talk about school, Malik now mumbled through one-word answers and kept his gaze on the syrup bottle. Jerome wasn't the type to push. He believed in space. Believed that a boy, especially a black boy in a white world, needed time to process. But even he had his limits. One night, as they sat side by side watching a rerun of Chicago Fire, Jerome muted the television and turned to his son. "You still proud of what I do?" he asked. Malik, caught off guard, blinked at the question. "Of course I am." Jerome nodded. "Then why you walking around like it's something to be ashamed of?" Malik opened his mouth, then closed it. He wanted to explain, to describe the way the laughter felt like a punch. But instead he just said, "I don't know." Jerome didn't press further. He reached over, placed a firm hand on Malik's shoulder and gave it a squeeze. "People are always going to question you, especially when you tell them something they didn't expect to hear from someone who looks like you. But that don't make it less true." Wednesday came and went with nothing out of the ordinary. Thursday was the same. By Friday morning, most of the school had shifted into autopilot mode. Students filed in late, clutching lukewarm juice boxes, dragging their feet through morning announcements. Mr. Callahan had barely begun the warm-up activity. Something about local government roles. When the fire alarm blared. At first, no one reacted. It was one of those moments where the brain can't quite decide whether to take something seriously. Then came the sharp smell of smoke, not distant, not imagined, real, acrid, immediate. A ripple of panic spread through the room. Some kids stood up too fast. A chair toppled. Mr. Callahan's voice cracked as he ordered everyone to line up and follow him. But the moment they reached the hallway, they were met with a wall of heat and smoke. The main stairwell, usually their exit during drills, was blocked by gray-black air and the unmistakable roar of something burning. Mr. Callahan froze. Truly froze. His face drained of color. He mumbled something about the alternate exit, turned the wrong way, and fumbled with a locked door. Malik's body went cold, but his mind didn't. He remembered the steps. His father's voice echoed in his head, crisp and calm. "Get low. Cover your mouth. Don't run. Think." While Mr. Callahan fumbled with the hallway door, Malik pulled the sleeve of his hoodie over his hand and opened the emergency stair door at the opposite end. It wasn't their usual route, but it wasn't locked. He turned to the others. "This way," he said, steady but urgent. A few kids hesitated. Mr. Callahan shouted, "Stay in line," but he didn't sound convincing. Malik grabbed a damp mop from a nearby janitor's closet and started handing out paper towels. "Wet these and cover your mouth," he instructed. Some of the girls began to cry. One boy was wheezing, his asthma acting up. Malik knelt beside him and said, "We'll get out. Just breathe slow. Stay with me." Downstairs, the fire crews were arriving. Sirens echoed off the brick walls of the school, growing louder by the second. The crowd outside grew. Students evacuated from other wings, parents alerted by texts, and then, slicing through the noise, a familiar red Ford Explorer came to a screeching halt. Jerome leapt out, already halfway into his gear. He didn't wait for orders. The dispatcher had said the second floor, north wing, heavy smoke, blocked stairwell. He knew exactly where Malik's homeroom was. Within minutes he was inside, breathing through his mask, axe in hand, heart pounding not from fear, but from something older, something primal. Fathers don't run toward fire for glory. They run for blood, for love, for the child who said, "My dad is a firefighter," and wasn't believed. Back on the second floor, Malik guided his classmates through the stairwell. They were coughing, scared, but moving. He stayed near the rear, counting heads, checking for stragglers. Just as the smoke thickened to the point of blindness, he heard boots, heavy, deliberate. And then, through the haze, a figure emerged. Helmet, visor, breathing apparatus. But even with the mask on, Malik recognized the stance, the shoulders, the stride. "Dad?" he gasped. Jerome knelt immediately, pulled the boy close. "You okay?" Malik nodded, chest tight. Jerome scanned the group. "You got them this far?" "Yeah," Malik said. "They followed me." "Then let's get you the rest of the way." The team cleared the last hallway in record time. Students stumbled into daylight, eyes red, hands trembling, but alive. Teachers rushed to count heads. Paramedics moved in. And somewhere in the chaos, Malik stood under the sun, coughing, soot-streaked, but upright. He looked back toward the building, where his father disappeared again into smoke, returning for another wing. No camera crews captured it. No news van had arrived yet. But everyone who saw it, every student, every teacher, every parent, would remember. Mr. Callahan stood off to the side, his shirt soaked through, clipboard clutched uselessly in his hand. When he saw Malik, their eyes met for the first time since Monday. Something passed between them. Not words. Not yet. Just a flicker of realization. Of shame. Of something shifting. Later, when the flames were fully extinguished and students were released early, Jerome finally found Malik again, this time outside the station where he'd parked. He knelt, cupped the boy's face in both hands, and said simply, "You were brave today." Malik shook his head. "I just did what you always said." Jerome grinned, teeth white against the ash on his face. "Then you listened better than most." That night, at the dinner table, neither of them spoke much. But they didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't heavy now. It was whole. It was earned. By Monday, the school had been scrubbed of the smoke, but not of the memory. Custodians worked overtime to clean the walls, repaint stair rails, and air out the building with industrial fans that hummed behind every hallway. But the air still carried something else. An energy that hadn't been there before. Malik felt it the moment he stepped into room 12B. It wasn't louder. If anything, it was quieter, more aware, more watchful. The chatter that usually preceded the first bell was subdued. The glances were different too, not the kind that sized him up, but the kind that carried curiosity, respect, maybe even apology, though most didn't know how to say it. Mr. Callahan stood at the front of the class, tie slightly off-center, hair combed but less stiff than usual. For once, his clipboard was nowhere in sight. Instead, he had a stack of news clippings printed out on the projector, headlines from local outlets praising the bravery of the Springfield Fire Department, particularly the team from Station 17. One headline read, "Fire Captain Rescues Students During Blaze, Including His Own Son." Another, "Middle Schooler Leads Class to Safety Amid Fire Chaos." Malik recognized the photo that followed. It was taken by a parent outside the building, Jerome in full gear, hand on Malik's shoulder, both of them caught in a moment between urgency and relief. Mr. Callahan adjusted his glasses and faced the room. "Before we begin today, I'd like to say something." The class stilled. He looked at Malik, not skimming past him like before, but holding the gaze. "Last week I made a mistake, a serious one. I dismissed something that should never have been questioned. I laughed at the truth." The words didn't rush. They arrived carefully, like they had been practiced more than once. "And for that, Malik, I owe you not just an apology, but my respect." A few students turned toward Malik. He didn't smile, didn't nod. He simply met Mr. Callahan's eyes and held them steady. He didn't need to say anything. The silence was enough. As the class moved into its usual rhythm, something fundamental had shifted. Malik no longer felt like he had to shrink into his chair to be left alone. He didn't have to speak louder or prove himself. The room had recalibrated, not just around him, but around the truth he had carried all along. At lunch, Jason walked over with a tray in hand and hesitated at the end of the table. "Can I sit?" he asked. Malik shrugged. "Sure." They didn't talk much at first, but as the minutes passed, the words came more easily. Small, familiar, like rain after drought. Jason finally asked, "Why didn't you say anything earlier? About your dad, I mean. That he really was a firefighter." Malik looked at him for a long second. "I did." Jason blinked, then looked away. He didn't argue. He knew. That was the difference. Later that week, the school held a recognition assembly in the gym, something they hadn't done in years, but the board insisted after the fire. Students filed into the bleachers, teachers lined the walls, and parents were invited to attend. Principal Garcia took the microphone first, thanking first responders, praising the quick thinking of staff, and most of all the bravery of the students. "But today," she said, "we want to recognize one young man in particular, someone whose actions likely saved lives, someone who kept calm when most adults didn't." She turned slightly. "Malik Thompson, would you please join me on stage?" The gym filled with applause, clapping at first tentative, then stronger, rippling outward like a tide. Malik stood slowly, palms sweating, heart hammering against his ribs. As he walked down the steps and across the gym floor, he could see his father in the crowd, standing near the back, hands clasped in front of him, chest slightly puffed. Jerome nodded once, just once, but Malik saw everything in that gesture. Approval, pride, love. On stage, Principal Garcia handed Malik a plaque. It wasn't big, just wood and brass, but it felt heavier than it looked. She leaned toward the microphone and added, "Courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a boy doing the right thing when no one's watching. Sometimes it's telling the truth, even when people laugh." Mr. Callahan was in the audience too, off to the side, clapping with the rest. When Malik stepped down from the stage, their eyes met again. This time, Malik offered a nod. Small, controlled, but real. That evening, back at home, Jerome grilled chicken on the back patio while Malik sat on the steps with a soda in hand. The air was warm, crickets beginning their nightly chorus, and the scent of mesquite smoke curling up into the sky. Jerome turned to the chicken once, then said, "You handled all that pretty well." Malik smiled softly. "I just told the truth." Jerome turned to look at him. "Sometimes that's the hardest thing to do." Malik sipped from the can. "Why do people always think we're making stuff up?" Jerome let out a slow breath. "Because the world wasn't built with us in mind, son. They don't expect us to be the heroes. They don't expect us to be the ones with the answers or the bravery or the stories worth telling. But that's their problem, not ours." Malik looked down at the plaque in his lap. "Does it ever get easier?" Jerome nodded once. "Not always. But it gets clearer. You just keep telling the truth. Let the room catch up." The next week, Malik was back in room 12B. Only now the world inside it had changed shape. The posters on the wall were the same. The clock still ran 2 minutes slow, and Mr. Callahan still handed out dry worksheets. But the gaze was different. When Malik raised his hand, the teacher called on him without pause. When he spoke, classmates listened. When someone mentioned career day in passing, 2 kids said, "You should totally bring your dad." He wasn't invisible anymore. He was seen, and not for a dramatic story, but for the quiet consistency of who he always was. Months later, when another student mentioned becoming a firefighter, Mr. Callahan didn't laugh. He looked at Malik first, like he was silently asking permission to do better. Malik gave the smallest nod. That was enough. Years from now, Malik would still remember that week, not the smoke or the fear, but the moment everything turned. Not because a fire was put out, but because a truth was finally lit bright enough that no one could ignore it. And when he grew into his own man, whether he chose to follow his father's footsteps or forge a new path, he'd carry that lesson like a badge, invisible but present. Because the truth, once spoken, doesn't disappear. It echoes. And sometimes, it saves more than just lives. It saves the dignity of being believed. And that's a kind of rescue, too. What would you think if a teacher, someone entrusted with nurturing young minds, stood before a classroom and humiliated a black boy, not because he misbehaved, not because he lied, but simply because he dared to speak his truth? 11-year-old Malik Rivers was proud to share that his father was Vin Diesel, a man the world knew, but he knew as Dad. Yet instead of support, Malik was met with laughter, sneers, and disbelief. His teacher, Mrs. Bishop, coldly dismissed his words, reducing his identity to a punchline, all because his skin didn't match the image they had in mind. The class mocked him. The adults stayed silent. But when the truth came walking through the classroom door in the most unexpected way, the deep, quiet prejudice that had lingered beneath the surface was brought into the light. Stay with us to witness how justice doesn't always shout, but when it speaks, the whole room listens. The morning air in Greenville, South Carolina, felt heavy, humid with the weight of something unspoken. 11-year-old Malik Rivers stood at the curb outside their modest brick house, adjusting the straps of his backpack, while his mother, Tasha, knelt to check his shoelaces one last time. She didn't say much, just looked at him with that quiet worry mothers carry when they send their black sons into unfamiliar spaces. "You're smart, you're kind, and you belong," she whispered. Malik nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed it. He'd been the new kid before, twice in fact. But this place felt different. Their neighborhood was quiet, too quiet. The first day they arrived, an elderly white couple across the street paused, mowing their lawn to stare. Another woman pulled her child inside without a wave or a smile. Not hateful exactly, just suspicious, like Malik and his mother had shown up in the wrong movie. The school bus pulled up with a hiss and groan. As Malik stepped on, the chatter inside died down just a little. just enough for him to notice. Dozens of unfamiliar eyes glanced his way, measured him silently, and then turned back to their conversations. No one moved to make room. He took a seat near the back, pressed his bag to his chest, and stared out the window. Brookside Middle was clean, the kind of place with banners reading "character counts" and tidy mulch around the flagpole. But as Malik walked the halls toward his homeroom, he felt that familiar coldness in the air, the kind that doesn't come from air conditioning. He was greeted not with smiles, but with half-glances, quick looks that assessed him and then dismissed him. In room 208, his homeroom teacher, Mrs. Bishop, stood beside the whiteboard. She looked up from her attendance sheet when Malik entered, offering a tight-lipped smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was in her late 50s, her salt and pepper bob curled neatly under her ears, her eyes sharp behind reading glasses. "Class," she announced, barely glancing at Malik again. "We have a new student." "This is Malik?" "Malik," he corrected softly. "Right. From where?" "Atlanta," he said. "Well," she said, already turning back to the board. "Find a seat, please. Colin, scoot over." The blond boy by the window didn't move until she barked his name again. He gave Malik a sideways glance, wrinkled his nose, and pushed his backpack aside with a sigh, as if making space was a chore. Malik sat quietly, folded his hands, and focused on breathing evenly. He tried to pay attention, to follow the lesson, to raise his hand when he knew an answer. But each time he did, Mrs. Bishop would glance past him, never calling on him, not once. When he did answer a question correctly during group work, she gave a tight nod but didn't offer praise. But Colin got warm smiles and chuckles when he stumbled, gentle corrections when he was wrong, and full-throated praise when he got anything right. By lunch, Malik had felt the divide so clearly he didn't bother trying to talk to anyone. He walked slowly through the cafeteria with his tray, scanning the room for any open seat. But the minute he moved toward a table, kids would shift away, whisper, or suddenly pretend the space was taken. He sat alone in the farthest corner, picking at his sandwich while laughter and cliques buzzed around him. He heard his name once, followed by snickers. He didn't look up. The week dragged. Every day felt like a rehearsal for invisibility. He didn't want to cause trouble. He didn't want to be labeled. But he couldn't stop the ache. At home, when his mom asked how his day went, he always said, "Fine," and escaped to his room. She didn't press. Maybe she knew. Maybe she didn't. But one thing she always said echoed in his heart. Don't ever let the world convince you you're smaller than you are. Then, on Monday morning, Mrs. Bishop stood at the front of the class and announced something new. Next Friday will be our annual Career Hero Day. Each of you will prepare a short presentation about someone in your family, ideally a parent or grandparent, and tell us what they do and why they inspire you. The room came alive with chatter. My mom's a nurse. My dad builds houses. My aunt's a pilot. Malik sat up straighter. For the first time since arriving, he felt something stir in his chest. He already knew what he was going to say. That night in the corner of the bedroom, they barely had time to decorate. Malik pulled out a worn shoebox filled with keepsakes. Inside were birthday cards, a faded letter, and a single photograph, the one he wasn't supposed to show around. In it, a younger Vin Diesel, real name Mark Sinclair, held a swaddled baby in his arms. His hand rested protectively on the child's back, and the smile on his face wasn't for a camera. It was for his son. Malik stared at the picture, his fingers brushing over the glossy surface. His mother had told him the truth years ago. The world-famous actor had once been part of her life, part of his, before fame pulled him into shadows where secrets became necessary. There were no headlines, no public claims, but there were phone calls, letters, visits that stopped once tabloids began sniffing, Still, he remembered the voice, deep and kind, telling him, "You're stronger than people know." All week, Malik worked on his speech. He wrote and rewrote it, practiced in the mirror, tried to make his voice steady, his words clear. "My dad's name is Mark Sinclair, but the world knows him as Vin Diesel. He's my hero because even when he became famous, he didn't forget me. He told me to be proud, to stand tall, and to never be ashamed of who I am." His mother watched him quietly from the hallway, a soft sadness in her eyes. She never discouraged him, but she never encouraged him either. She just said, "Tell the truth, but be ready if they don't believe it." On Thursday, the day before the presentations, Malik carefully placed the photo into a plastic sleeve and tucked it into his folder. At recess, while other kids played, he stayed behind to review his notes. That's when Colin and two of his friends approached. "So," Colin said loudly, loud enough for others to hear, "who are you gonna say your dad is tomorrow? LeBron? Obama?" Malik looked up and said calmly, "Vin Diesel." For a moment, there was silence. Then came the laughter, not just from Colin and his friends, but from a few kids nearby who had heard. Colin grinned like he'd been handed a gift. "Vin Diesel? You're joking, right? Bro, look at you. He's white. You..." He laughed harder. "You're like the exact opposite." One boy chimed in, "Maybe your mom wishes he was your dad." Malik felt the heat rise in his ears. He clenched his fists, but said nothing. His heart pounded, not with anger, but with shame he didn't deserve. When they walked away, still laughing, he pulled the photo out from his folder and stared at it again. The smile on his father's face was still there, just like before. But now it felt distant, fragile, like something too rare for the world around him to accept. For the first time, he wondered if telling the truth was worth the pain it always brought. He had no idea that the next day, in front of the whole class, the truth wouldn't just be laughed at. It would be publicly torn down by the very person whose job it was to teach him. Friday morning arrived, thick with tension Malik couldn't quite name. The sky outside his window remained a dull gray, clouds hanging low as if even the weather was holding its breath. He dressed carefully, smoothing the wrinkles from the button-up shirt his mom had ironed the night before. He checked his backpack 3 times to make sure the photo of him and his father, carefully tucked inside its plastic sleeve, was still there. He stood in front of the mirror, repeated his lines once more, and told himself this would be the day everything changed. On the school bus, the usual hush followed him as he stepped on. Whispers flitted from row to row, glances shot his way. Somewhere near the front, someone muttered, "Hollywood faker," under their breath. Malik clenched his jaw but didn't react. Today, he had proof. Today, the truth would speak louder than skin color. When he walked into room 208, Mrs. Bishop was already arranging the order of presentations. Her eyes barely acknowledged him, cold and indifferent as always. He sat quietly near the window, trying to steady his breathing. One by one, his classmates went up to the front of the room. A girl spoke proudly about her mom, a local dentist. Another boy beamed while sharing how his dad worked in construction. Colin strutted up next, his tone loud and confident as he detailed his father's glory as head coach of Greenville High's football team. The class clapped enthusiastically. Mrs. Bishop smiled at him like he was her own grandson. Then came Malik's turn. He stood up, legs trembling slightly, and walked slowly to the front. His heart pounded in his ears, but his hands didn't shake. He placed the photo carefully on Mrs. Bishop's desk, next to the notes he had written. A few kids snickered. Colin leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, grinning like he was waiting for a joke. Malik took a deep breath. "My name is Malik Rivers," he began, "and my hero is my dad, Mark Sinclair. But you probably know him as Vin Diesel." The class didn't wait. The laughter erupted instantly, Loud, merciless, unfiltered. Malik froze. Colin slapped his desk, laughing so hard he had to wipe tears from his eyes. "You've got to be kidding me," he howled. "Vin Diesel? Bro, come on. Do you even own a mirror?" Malik opened his mouth, trying to push through, but Mrs. Bishop raised a hand to silence the room. The laughter quieted, but smirks remained. She looked at Malik, her expression unreadable, and then, with a sigh that said far more than her words ever could, she said, "Malik, let's not turn this into a fantasy exercise. Career Hero Day is about real people in your life, not celebrities you see on TV." Malik's face turned pale. His voice faltered. But he is my dad. I have... That's enough. She cut him off, her voice sharp, final. "You're not here to play pretend. Sit down." No one said anything after that. There was no laughter left, only an awkward silence so heavy it felt suffocating. Malik picked up his photo with trembling hands and walked back to his seat. No one met his eyes, not even the ones who had laughed the hardest. But the damage was done. His name had become a punchline, and worse. His truth had been denied not by peers, but by the adult who was supposed to protect him. After class, as kids poured into the hallway, Colin walked by Malik and muttered just loud enough to be heard, "Maybe next time pick someone more believable." Then he laughed and disappeared down the corridor. Malik didn't go to lunch. He sat in the library, hunched over an empty notebook, staring at the photograph like it was written in another language no one in this town could read. He didn't cry. He didn't move. When the final bell rang, he walked home in silence, barely hearing the cars that passed him. His mother was in the kitchen when he got home, chopping onions, her music playing low on the radio. She turned when he walked in, immediately seeing the look on his face. He didn't speak, just handed her the crumpled speech and the photo, then turned and walked to his room. That night after he'd gone to bed, Tasha sat at the kitchen table reading every word he had written. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. Instead, she opened the old shoebox again. Inside were more than just memories. There were truths the world refused to believe. She stared at the photo, then picked up her phone and dialed a number she had stored for years but never used. It rang twice. Then a voice answered. "Hello? Mark, it's Tasha." A pause. Then, "Is he okay?" "No," she said, her voice calm but tight. "They called him a liar. His teacher, the kids. All because he told the truth." There was a longer silence on the other end. "I'll be there tomorrow," he said. Tell him he did the right thing." The next morning, Malik said nothing on the way to school. He walked through the halls as if invisible. No one laughed now. Maybe the shame of watching someone be publicly humiliated had silenced them, or maybe they thought the joke had already run its course. Either way, they didn't look him in the eye. During homeroom, Mrs. Bishop acted like nothing had happened. She didn't mention the previous day. She didn't acknowledge the damage. She simply passed out worksheets and returned to her desk, business as usual. But Malik knew better. Something inside him had shifted. The part of him that once believed adults always told the truth had cracked open. And what spilled out was not anger, but clarity. At 9:17 a.m., there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Bishop, mid-sentence, looked up, surprised. The door opened slowly, and a tall man in a dark gray hoodie and jeans stepped inside. The room went completely still. The kids stared. Some gasped. It was him. Vin Diesel didn't speak right away. He looked around the room, his eyes scanning faces until they settled on Malik, sitting frozen in his seat, lips slightly parted in disbelief. The man smiled softly and walked to the front of the class. "I believe," he said, voice calm but commanding. "There's been some confusion." Mrs. Bishop stood up, blinking rapidly. "Mr. Diesel, I didn't expect—" "No," he said, turning to her. I imagine you didn't. Because you didn't believe him. Because my son doesn't look like me. Because in your mind the color of his skin made his truth impossible. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. The room was silent, not just with shock, but with something heavier. Guilt, recognition, a slow, painful awareness. Vin looked back at Malik. You didn't lie, he said. You told your story, and you should never be ashamed of that. Then he turned to the class. This young man is my son, not because he looks like me, not because of fame, but because he is mine. And the truth doesn't need permission to be spoken. The student sat, eyes wide, not daring to laugh now. And Mrs. Bishop? She lowered her head, lips trembling, the weight of her own prejudice finally settling on her shoulders, too heavy to ignore. The silence that followed Vin Diesel's words didn't just fill the room. It changed it. The students who had mocked Malik, the ones who whispered behind his back or laughed in his face, now stared in stunned silence. Their eyes, once filled with ridicule, were wide with disbelief and discomfort. They were seeing something they never expected. A man they recognized from movie screens standing firmly behind a truth they had dismissed, a truth that didn't fit into the narrow mold of their expectations. Malik sat motionless at his desk, the whirlwind of emotion crashing in waves across his face. Relief, confusion, pride, and something deeper. Something tender that had been buried for far too long. Mrs. Bishop still stood behind her desk, fingers twitching slightly against the edge of the table, her gaze lowered to the floor. For the first time in years, she had nothing to say. Vin's eyes turned to her again. His voice remained calm, but there was a weight behind every word. You looked at my son and decided, without evidence, that he couldn't be who he said he was. You judged him not by his words, not by his courage, but by the color of his skin. She opened her mouth, searching for a defense, but no words came out. Because there were none. If Malik had been white, he continued, would you have laughed? Would you have called him a liar in front of his classmates? Or would you have believed him, simply because his skin matched the image you had in your mind? No one moved. No one dared to interrupt. Vin turned back to the students. Let me tell you something. Families don't all look the same. Love doesn't follow a single color. And truth doesn't have a face. It doesn't need permission from your expectations. It stands on its own. Malik felt something stir inside him, something stronger than all the shame he'd carried for days. He stood slowly. His knees felt weak, but his heart beat steady. He walked up to the front of the classroom and stood beside his father. The room, once so cold and dismissive, now watched him with wide eyes and uncertain silence. I didn't come here to brag, Malik said quietly, but clearly. I didn't say my dad was Vin Diesel because I wanted attention. I said it because it's the truth. But nobody believed me. Because of how I look. Because you thought someone like me doesn't deserve someone like him. He looked directly at Mrs. Bishop, and for the first time, she lifted her eyes to meet his. There was no defiance in her expression now, only shame. My skin doesn't make my story less true, he said, and I shouldn't have to prove who I am just to be treated with respect. A long pause followed, then Vin placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. You were brave, Malik, and I am proud of you. The bell rang, but no one moved. The moment hung in the air, still and raw. Later that afternoon, the principal called an emergency meeting with Mrs. Bishop, Malik's mother, and the school counselor. Tasha arrived in scrubs, hair pulled back, her eyes clear and unflinching. She listened as the principal tried to explain the misunderstanding, tried to frame it as an unfortunate miscommunication. But she didn't let it slide. My son was publicly humiliated, she said, voice steady. Not by accident, but by assumption. He wasn't just doubted, he was dismissed. Because he's black. Because his story didn't match what you thought was believable. Mrs. Bishop remained quiet, her usual confidence broken. She finally spoke, softly. I'm sorry. I was wrong. I should have listened. I should have trusted him. Tasha didn't respond right away. Then she said, "You owe my son more than a private apology." The principal agreed. It was decided that Mrs. Bishop would address the entire school at Monday's assembly. That weekend, Malik didn't hide in his room. He helped his mother cook dinner, watched movies with her, even laughed a little. Vin stayed in town through Sunday and took Malik to the local park where they kicked a soccer ball and talked about everything. Movies, music, life, and what it meant to be seen, really seen, not just as a celebrity's son, but as a full person. Malik asked him, "Why didn't you ever go public about me?" Vin paused, then answered honestly, "I thought I was protecting you. I didn't want you caught up in the mess of fame, but maybe I was just protecting myself." Malik nodded. "I don't need people to know. I just needed someone to believe me." On Monday morning, the school auditorium filled with students and teachers. No one quite knew what was about to happen. Mrs. Bishop stood on stage, hands clasped, her expression tense but resolved. She stepped up to the microphone and took a deep breath. "Last week, during Career Hero Day, I made a mistake," she began. "A serious mistake. I doubted a student's words based on my own assumptions. I allowed prejudice, unspoken but real, to guide my reaction, and I hurt someone who trusted me. I am deeply sorry." She turned to Malik, who sat in the front row beside his mother. "Malik, I hope you can forgive me, and I hope everyone in this room learns from what happened. We must do better, all of us." There was a pause. Then slowly, applause began to ripple through the crowd, soft at first, then louder, fuller. Malik felt heat rise to his face, not from shame this time, but from the strange, overwhelming power of being recognized, not as a joke, but as someone whose truth mattered. In the days that followed, the air at Brookside Middle School shifted. Subtle at first, but real. Colin stopped sneering when he passed Malik in the hall. Some kids who had once laughed now waved or offered small smiles. Malik didn't become popular overnight, but he became visible. His story, once mocked, had broken through something deeper than ignorance. It had cracked the shell of casual racism and forced the school to confront the small, quiet ways prejudice shows its face. Mrs. Bishop, too, changed. She asked Malik to help her develop a classroom project on identity and truth, encouraging students to share family stories in all their messy, complex forms. Malik agreed, not because he needed the attention, but because he understood now that change only happens when someone is willing to be the first to speak. A month later, the school held a community night. Parents, teachers, and students gathered for food and stories. Malik stood beside his mom and introduced Vin Diesel to those who came over, not as a star, just as his father. Vin didn't stay long. Just enough to shake hands, share a smile, and quietly place a hand on Malik's back before heading out. That night, as Malik lay in bed, he stared at the ceiling and thought about everything that had happened. He thought about the laughter, the shame, the disbelief, but also about the moment the door opened and his truth stepped into the room, no longer needing to shout to be heard. He had stood up, been knocked down, and stood again. And now, in the silence of his small bedroom, he finally felt what he had wanted all along. Not validation, not fame, but dignity. He whispered into the dark, "I'm not just his son. I'm my own person, and that's enough." And it was. Because sometimes the bravest thing a child can do is speak the truth. and wait for the world to catch up.